Hello, how are you? I would like to share with you how much the translation of music is a subtle art. And despite of aging, it remains an always to be rediscovered medium. In fact, the pieces of music that travel with one's life reveal themselves differently, in a way arrogantly young when we age, but they remain as provocative, as deeply meaningful as the first day you visit them. Either because somebody played it, either because you sight read it, either because you heard somebody play it, you went to look at the score and started thinking, how come it doesn't sound like it's read, like it's notated? Perhaps that gap between the intent and the notation compared to the translation through the interpretation is where the heart of live music, of communicative emotion is. It's easy to have certitudes and say, okay, well, I know because of tradition, I know because of teachers, I know because of reading. In other words, erudite doesn't suppress, hopefully, the instinctive, intuitive approach. Being erudite is what we all tend to be. We cultivate our brain from birth, we fill it up with knowledge, with facts, with our own capacity of thinking about what we were presented of, what are the world's facts. And the facts of music seem objective since the notation is mostly for pitches and, of course, also rhythms. But the composers leave room for the interpreter to play, in fact, some things as they like. Does it mean that they surrender something precious? Does it mean that they trust the performer? Or does it mean that they're careless in their notation and leaving this, in fact, loop areas where you can go into different directions and fear of betraying the piece? When the piece is written in another time period where the expected tradition would have been either taught, either heard, and therefore imitated, outside of that ecosystem, we have to reconstitute it. So it becomes like a museum reconstitution of an old artifact. But in fact, it's not an artifact. It's living and breathing as if it was written today, because in a way playing it is rewriting it. Of course, we don't have the right to rewrite it. Especially as a teacher, you want to teach the students to respect the text and then find what it means to them in order for them to be believable when they translate it through their playing. Of course, ideally, you should want to learn all the alphabet of every language so that you can speak and understand the innuendo subtleties of each and then be able to be translating the meaning of them as well as the secondary meanings and the ironic aspects and the tender aspects and sometimes the contradictory heroic aspects, sometimes defeated, sometimes victorious. The music is inevitably the translation of human soul, but also through the experience of their time. So heroism in Beethoven is not heroism in Chopin, or tenderness in Bach is not tenderness in Scriabin. And what does it mean? It means, in fact, that we navigate with our intuitive emotional vibration towards different entities which are either mysterious, either self-evident, or some of them totally opaque, and we have to read and learn their alphabet in order to really decipher it typically. And teaching is being there on behalf of the dead composer most of the time, decoding for the student what the notation doesn't fully say according to one's own understanding. And if you cannot argument it to the student, then you have to be honest and say, that's how I like it. Which is a very shortcut for why it should be like that. And sometimes if you know why, you end up in a system, and the system then obliges you to compare examples with their exceptions, and then you end up in a very difficult situation where you have to be always proving yourself right, when in fact you can very well have more exceptions to the rule than the rule itself. As we don't know, and we feel, and when we have some experiments with different instruments with whom we play, we realize how some of the indications correspond to a bowed instrument or to the voice, the breathing, the air, which are necessary to the performance of any phrase. When the piano, it's in a way asphyxiating. There's no need to breathe. It's mechanical, or so it appears. And since the music imitates mostly singing or dancing, in many aspects through the ages, that were the elements besides the spiritual uplifting meaning and necessity of music. Then also came the intellectual construction of the formats and the different genres and forms. I mean, a fugue is certainly not intuitive as a form, but a song is, especially with lyrics, when then the music becomes the tone painting of the thoughts, of the mood of the lyrics. And then again, we enter in the translation problem with the lyrics, because we can translate their meaning, but not always their innuendo. And so without lyrics, the music is supposed to be universal. It is, but you have to penetrate each culture of meaning to subtly distinguish between an anguish in Schumann or in Scriabin, or calm in Beethoven or Bach. And the indications, besides the tones and the pitches, are often in the words. And the words are for moods or atmospheres. And they differ inevitably from the experience of the people of their time. What is moderate or slow, for a century where we are always for the instantaneous between the connections of people or transports, everything tends to go so much more faster. And so something moderate for a 21st century person might be faster than something moderate as a tempo for somebody in the 18th century. That doesn't mean that they were all slow, far from there. It's actually fantastic to see how much they composed in music, in quantity, in quality, in complexity, in subtlety, without any of the modern comforts that most of us, not all of us, on this planet today experience or take for granted. Electricity, medications, nutrition, clean water. I mean, all these, not to mention the electronic helps. What if Bach had a computer? What if Beethoven had a photocopy machine? What if Chopin didn't have to copy his piece twice or 3 times to send it to different publishers and then induce expectedly, unwillingly, or even sometimes perhaps bonifying some details in different editions that create for us a puzzle to reach out what is the exact origin of each of their thoughts, as if we can always go back to that. Sometimes we can't. In most of the cases in Bach, for instance, Chromatic Fantasy and Fugue, the manuscript is gone. So we only have copies of students, inevitably tainted by their own either unwilling mistakes, either their desired customizations, since all of the performers until the 20th century by essence were composers without to even consider it as such. It's just they were composing, therefore they were playing, and occasionally they play music of others, as Chopin played mostly his, but Liszt played some of the others. And then before that, Mozart never was asked to play any Bach in public, or is expected to compose something for the occasion, and therefore all of the other performers also composed. And of course we don't know all of the music, or we do without to be able to, out of curiosity, time constraints, and imposed repertoires of value that in fact we have to cover, which prevailed over the lesser known repertoires because they fail to make it to us as prominently as the others. The dictionaries are full of composers nobody remembers of, and then so many didn't even make it to the dictionary. So it's humbling, but at the same time you realize that the composers we serve didn't exist as islands out of deserts. They existed among an ecosystem of musicians, all composers who played them, played themselves, performed them, perhaps even adapted them without to consider it a composition or an interpretation or a transcription or an arrangement or a reduction or a paraphrase, all of the above. So the art of interpretation, which became some kind of recitation from a single score, which imposes itself through addition as being the original text, is a bit like political correctness in music. And to think outside of the box is to be inevitably a sculptor who is careless, a musician who appears to be arrogant, and then the ones who are very respectful, in fact, provide very much of this truth. And the subjective truth is a problem because the objective truth is shared. And sometimes you go against the wind or against the waves when you want to say, but for me this sonata has to be in this tempo. And you say it through your playing, and then or you say, I would like this ending to be this way, or the balance of the instruments on the piano forte from the 19th century was not the same as the 21st century piano, inevitably. So in order to transport this texture today through the modern piano, which gives us immense possibilities of length of sound and pedal holding or separate pedal holding with the middle pedal, the composer didn't wait for this invention to happen to write textures that imply that, almost like organ on the piano, or harp in the top and organ in the bottom and the melodic line in the middle, of six-voice fugues, or in fact symphonic writing on the piano, polyphonic. All these things are very important to teach in order to separate them from the performing itself. In other words, when you play, I think you should reach to your childhood or to your youth or to whenever you got in awe with the pieces that you serve, and not use the accumulated knowledge, education, and in fact, in a way, shaping of the intuitive understanding of the music in order to let it flow most naturally. It might for sure be cultivated by the fact of life, but in a way, I think it's like composing, it's retrieving something deep from your memory, as if you remember it and it comes out. And then, in a way, improvising is almost like driving at night with very little headlights because you don't know where you go, but you explore. And you don't know where it leads you to. Whenever a composition, formally speaking, you basically know where it leads you, at least when you write it. And if the form is evident to the audience, like a GPS, they know where you are in the piece, even if they don't know that very piece. And then the educated audience obviously becomes critical. On top of it, the interpretations become multiple and documented through recordings and video today, and who knows what will be tomorrow, perhaps holograms or more. And so the work itself, the notation, and then the translation to the performing, and then establishing standards for the different performances, which can be compared. And the music lover can very well say, I like this piece, but only through the interpretation of this or this performer, living or dead. Then it taints the piece by the performer's opinion. So of course, if we all could read music and not need an interpreter, then we won't need to go to concerts or hear recordings. It will be very sad not to share the emotions of the moment. But will be just like reading a book on your own, but perhaps in a library altogether sitting. It will be a concert hall with audiences and scores. But I think somebody has to incarnate on stage the thoughts, the inspiration, the imaginary characters, the imaginary moods, the incredible landscapes or soundscapes through that. Yeah. I think even if it betrays the work, it's better than if we only try to objectivize the interpretation through editions and scholarly knowledge. It should be part, and it is, of our upbringing as musicians, but it shouldn't be the alpha and omega of it. I think the essence of it should be the, more than ever, instant connection, one time through, a piece dearly played or studied, cherished or fought for through the years, and the difficulties, the technical ones, the musical ones, the aesthetical ones, the all what it is to be in touch with this piece and share it with the audience as a living membrane, vibrating with the audience, but also playing it. Some kind of a chamber music of a performer with an audience, personalizing, perhaps in a way overly so, like Busoni did for Bach, and today people wouldn't dare because it would be considered politically incorrect to change a note to a masterpiece. And in fact, the threshold between interpretation and composition is very, very, very thin. You can betray the piece by playing it right, as well you can love the piece by playing it customized. And perhaps people would connect to it. Of course, if the tradition imposes a certain way, then you're obliged to fit to that way because people expect that. But teaching younger generations who come with the same quests to me and trust me to tell them what I should be telling them they should do in it. Not because they don't know, I respect them even when they're still new with the piece compared to me being older with the piece. I respect them because I find that their fresh approach is healthily questioning the status quo of mine about the piece. And if it's just to undo what they, I think, wrongly understood, would be a binary, unsubtle way of teaching. I think teaching is a subtle exchange around the service of a given piece, for which, in fact, the quest of the teacher relentlessly continues with every next student. And sometimes I find out when music library scores come back with other students who play something a former student played with my own markings unerased, the library's reborrowed book by the new student, I rediscover my markings from a few years ago, for instance, and I'm a little bit embarrassed because I think that all teachers write down different indications, more or less. And that's different technique of teaching, of course. But ultimately you realize that with the time passing, all these markings between the notation and then your own remarks plus the student's experience of it, which was just temporary, ephemeral during the lessons time, then these students live on their path of life, and they perhaps rediscover the piece differently, even contradictorily, or perhaps they start understanding better different layers of thoughts meant or suggested during the teaching, which were not able to be implemented right away. After all, it's not instant gratification. It's something that has to enter like sediments deep inside you. And then when you transmit the piece, in a way, you do restate it, not just repeat it. I think rediscover it, and sometimes to the point to which you get almost disturbed, because the piece reveals itself so differently that you're almost not recognizing what you're doing, but you're still playing, and you cannot play on autopilot only. You have to be really anticipating like a conductor on an orchestra every beat ahead. You have to think ahead before you do the different dynamic changes or contrasts or subtle dynamic or tempo merges into different tempi. In other words, you have to be architect, conductor, constructor, and at the same time just the maker, the player, the craftsman, and all at the same time inspired by the beauty of the music itself, which you inhale it. It's almost like a perfume in a way, the ephemeral combination of sounds. And I find it very I take it very at heart, let's put it this way, when a student asks me, should it be this way or that way, for the tempo, for the dynamics, for the phrasing, for the articulation, for the pedal, for the general construction of the pulse, by how many bars, by how many phrase lines, and the basically statement of the piece through one's playing. Of course, each hand is different, each approach of the touch is different, even if the instrument is industrially produced. Different ways of touching the keyboard bring out different aspects of the piece, or miss some. And it's a big and important responsibility to guide them towards who they really are in the piece, rather than to hope to clone them to what the piece means to me. One can argue that a good pedagogy is to give the answers in order for the student to ground their own interpretation into some certitudes. And this certainty will bring them self-confidence. It's already tough enough to play in front of people in terms of the reserve and the intimacy that is displayed through the musical psyche of the piece, through one's own naked psyche, so to say, which is why most students or performers consider it what they call the stage fright. I think it's just that this is the level of discomfort to share something so intimate that should be either read, either thought. But when it's incarnated, displayed through sounds and playing, it becomes your statement, the time of your performance. That's why I take very respectfully and attentively the questions and try to answer them in ways that I find how the different students can extract, as a sculptor, the essence from the material. It's not just, I like it faster, I like it louder. It's, or nor play like me. Sometimes it's a shortcut to explanation, but sometimes also explaining too much might be confusing, especially when you know that compared to my generation, or perhaps even the generation before me, when they studied, the teacher was the trusted, admired, only trusted opinion about all these facts of choosing tempi and articulation and phrasings and dynamics, with occasional performances heard here and there, occasional recordings. Today, when they come with a piece to you as a teacher, you know that they've heard it multiple times by many people already on the recordings available, incomparably so. They might say, I prefer this, I don't like this, and then I would like to be more like this one. So of course I teach more what I think the composer meant, but inevitably they superimpose what the interpretation of such and such performer meant to them more, or through which they want to enter in the piece. It's just like a different avenue leading to the same beautiful place. It's not the point just to be an analytical performer, nor to be just a copying performer of something you liked. But in a way, that's what we do since we are born. We imitate our parents. We learn our first mother tongue language by ear, and then all the others after we learn through grammar. Of course, music can be so many things to so many people. And the same piece can be so many things to so many people. And in order to maintain a sense of humility that you have to evolve, try relentlessly again to play the piece of what you think is the best way, or what you're told to be the best way, you have to have that self-esteem so that you don't have stage fright. Not that you want to be arrogant and say my way or no way, but since the piece reveals itself differently, what you rejected you might like later, aesthetically. And I find that the most meaningful lesson I take from teaching is that some of my students break my certitudes, and I feel like, I wouldn't have done that, but that's great. I didn't see that in the piece. Since it all comes down to, rather than see only through the score, hear in the piece. Hear in the intuitive hearing, not just the monitoring of what you do. In projecting yourself to what you wish and try to match it with the reality of your playing. And sometimes you have this idealized hearing inside your head of the piece, and then when you start playing it, either because of your technique or the acoustics or the piano, it reveals itself totally differently. And on stage you have to deal with the unexpected of it and try with, I guess, the practicing to control the touch in order to be less surprised by the different instruments you play. But inevitably you do. As a pianist, you don't transport your piano everywhere you go. So in a way, you rediscover the piece through the different, in fact, situation between the audience being different, the place being different, the instrument being different. And once you accept all these variables, then you can still find your own expression. Perhaps not the one you planned when you practiced it, but the one that reveals itself on the moment. And this ephemeral beauty is magic, because in a way, you can hear a recording many times, especially the ones you like, obviously. Why would you not? Why would you listen to the others many times? But a concert is a one-time experience, and sometimes the memories of a given emotional or intellectual sharing in the most intimate of our soul, even if we're sitting among many people, this reflective capacity that music gives us to mirror inside our souls the same questions that we feel are the humanity's eternal questions that are translated through the emotions of the music. then it becomes perhaps even more than a recorded situation, a memory of that moment that stays in your psyche for years, and say, oh, I remember when I heard this piece the first time. And most likely it might have been not the greatest performance that day, but somehow you met the piece through this performer. You could miss the meeting and pass next to it without to notice it. Or it can reveal itself to you and you might say, I never liked that piece before, but now with this performer, wow. I think that when you play with your contradictions as well as with your intentions. And all this happens in a split second. And you make sense of the unexpected. If you look too much all the variables, if you are able to, through technique and very strong mindset, to minimize these variables, I think you're no more in vibration with the piece. You should allow the piece to surprise you. Sometimes bite you. It happens often that you think so, as I just did. I heard the opening of the Chopin Minor Nocturne in my head, and then I played. Of course, I didn't hear it like it came out prior to playing it. I could delay the high note to enhance its eloquence. I could play the accompaniment waves softer with more changing pedal rather than some solid harmonization. I could play it in a more flowing tempo for the 2/3 rhythms that are purposely not fitting in emotional way. And I could think, oh, I should make more rubato. And dislocate with the bass line the melodic note. In a way to bring out the syllable of music, imaginary text being said in the right hands, eloquent singing. Or to the contrary, I would like to have it more static, more ecstatic, more contemplative. Also think that the decay of the melodic line in second and the third beat before the fourth beat, the next note after the long held dying decaying note should be picked up where the long value decayed, if that is a visualization of its decay, to pick the F sharp at the level where the G decayed before the F sharp played, and therefore the slower tempo stretches this to a limit that is impossible. And of course there is no vibrato on the piano, or a more percussive instrument makes this laughable, even if you can repeat it inside the lifting of the key halfway up because of the escapement of the action. Rather than... So you hear a lesser articulation of the consonant ha 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 rather than ta ta ta, but you still cannot prolong it unless you replay it, even halfway in or fully in. And even if you use a trill, which of course is not written, then you wonder, how did Chopin write a piece for piano which is supposed to imitate a singing aria, not taking in account that decay? Well, make believe? Possibly. Project intention? The pianists are less prisoners of tempos according to the instrument's action, because they have almost an unlimited bow, not really, but longer than a bow. Then they can stretch the tempo, or they don't have to breathe. What if this opening line was, I would like something, then would like, and they have to breathe something. I know it's a silly thing, I love you, or you cannot breathe in the middle of an important sentence, so you have to convey the words through the music. Here there are no music, no words, no music. That was funny. Want to replay it at the level in which the first long note dropped, at the level of which you played the first note, it appears as an accent. I personally privilege the first option, to pick it where it dropped and to re-rise in order to create the long phrase in a make-believe, perhaps in denial as a pianist, that this is a percussive instrument playing only on the resonance of a hit string by a hammer, and that there is no way you can re-enhance the resonance or the intensity of the sound once you've played it. But these are factually very important choices to make, or limitations to accept, in order to convey what the melodic line in this writing of an aria suggests of a singing voice on the piano. Chopin admired opera, didn't write any, at least for the short life he lived, but he wrote lyrical arias for most of his pieces for the piano, by the pianist he was. So we couldn't get closer to a pianist who loved the piano than Chopin, so exclusively, so to say, compared to other composers who also wrote for orchestra more, or string orchestra, or chamber music. All genres: Beethoven, Schubert, Schumann, Brahms, Grieg, Rachmaninoff, but Chopin was piano, so he knew what he was doing. Frédéric, I don't know, but I feel, and I'm sure you feel Chopin's music too, way beyond my playing, obviously, for itself, by itself. Long live music, Long live our service to our Muse. It brings us such rewarding moments of humanity, shared humanity.